When someone feels the sting of loss but isn't ready to confront it, they often reach for the easiest tool to mask the pain, performance. And in the modern world, that performance lives on social media. It's not healing, it's not growth, it's a strategy. You see, when she's pretending to be happy without you, one of the first places it shows is on her feed. It's subtle at first, a well-timed photo with a radiant smile, maybe a caption about peace, freedom, or finally being herself. But beneath that curated image, there's usually a psychological war taking place. Because if she were truly content, she wouldn't need to make such a show of it. Real peace is quiet. It doesn't need validation. But pretending needs witnesses. So she performs. Not just for her followers, not just for her friends, but most importantly, for you, the one she's trying to convince. And this isn't about narcissism. It's about a fragile ego trying to rewrite the story before the pain sets in too deeply. She wants to be the one who looks like she made the right call. The one who walked away and didn't flinch. Because if she can convince the world she's thriving, maybe she'll start to believe it too. And that's the trick. The performance isn't just to manipulate your perception. It's also to shield herself from her own doubts. Social media, in that sense, becomes a shield and a weapon. A shield from inner conflict and a weapon to stir insecurity in you. She may not say it directly, but every filtered smile, every highlight reel from a weekend trip or a night out is carefully chosen. It's all meant to say, look how well I'm doing without you. And here's the thing, if you were truly irrelevant, she wouldn't feel the need to make that statement at all. People don't put on shows for those they've emotionally detached from. They put on shows for the ones they're still tethered to. The very effort of trying to appear unaffected is itself evidence of the emotional weight that still exists. Because if she had genuinely moved on, she'd be indifferent, not performative. She wouldn't need to prove anything. That's the paradox of pretending to be happy. Real happiness doesn't need an audience, but performance does. And the more frequent and curated those performances become, the more obvious it is that she's still caught in the gravitational pull of what once was. You'll notice a shift. At first, the posts are vibrant, polished, almost aggressively joyful. Then they become cryptic, emotionally vague. Quotes about strength, self-love, and the pain of betrayal. What she's doing is testing the water. It's an emotional fishing expedition. She's watching your response, even if it's silence, especially if it's silence, because your silence is a mirror. And when her performance is met with no applause, no reaction, it creates discomfort. That discomfort often leads to more exaggerated displays. She doubles down, not because she's over you, but because the lack of validation is confirming what she fears the most, that you may actually be moving on without needing to prove it. This is when pretending becomes exhausting. The energy it takes to maintain the illusion begins to wear on her, because it's hard work to keep up appearances when your internal world doesn't match the image you're projecting. It becomes unsustainable, and eventually the mask starts to slip. That's the moment of reckoning. When she realizes that all the pictures, the stories, the inspirational quotes, they've done nothing to fill the void. The external noise hasn't quieted the internal questions, and there are always questions. She'll wonder why she still thinks about you when she's alone, why she still checks to see if you've seen her story, why the attention from others feels hollow. And those questions, left unanswered, begin to echo louder than the applause from her audience, because the audience doesn't really know her. You did. And that's what makes it harder. You knew the unfiltered version. You knew her before the performance. And no matter how polished her online presence looks, there's still a part of her that knows. Deep down, you can see through it. So if you find yourself watching her from a distance and wondering if she's really that happy, understand what you're seeing. You're not witnessing healing. You're witnessing image control. You're witnessing someone trying to win a narrative battle, not because they've won emotionally, but because they're afraid they've lost. The smile may be real in that second, but it's not the whole truth. And deep inside, she knows it. The truth doesn't need filters, and healing doesn't need an audience. But pretending needs both. You'll notice something fascinating. When someone pretends they're fine without you, they surround themselves with noise. social noise, new friends, new flings, constant activity. It's a frenzy of movement that on the surface looks like freedom, but underneath is often a desperate attempt to avoid sitting still, because in stillness, the truth has a way of creeping in, and the truth is uncomfortable. It's easier to run from it than to confront it. That's why she keeps moving. She fills her calendar, she fills her phone with conversations, and she surrounds herself with distractions. Because silence is dangerous. Silence brings clarity. In the early days after the breakup, this is often masked as living life to the fullest, but it's not authentic, it's survival. It's a reaction. She's not engaging with the world because she's overflowing with joy. She's engaging because she's trying not to feel the absence, your absence. She doesn't want to deal with the emotional consequences yet, so she outsources her peace to people, to events, to external stimulation, but it's fragile. It breaks the moment the music stops. It breaks the moment she's left alone with her thoughts. What's often misunderstood is that emotional disconnection doesn't mean emotional detachment. She might appear detached on the surface, but emotionally, there's still a deep entanglement. That's what drives the behavior. She doesn't want to admit that letting you go was more complicated than she expected. So instead of confronting that reality, she escapes it. She jumps into temporary relationships or entertains new romantic interests, not because she's ready for something real, but because she's trying to replace what she lost. But you can't replace something meaningful with something superficial and expect fulfillment. You can only delay the reckoning. The people around her might reinforce this illusion. They tell her she's doing great, that she looks amazing, that she's glowing, but validation from the outside is no substitute for inner peace. She might go along with it. She might even believe it for a moment, but eventually the cracks begin to show because nothing she's doing is rooted in wholeness. It's all compensation. It's all avoidance. And avoidance has a cost. You start to see it when the pace slows down, when the novelty of distraction wears thin, when the nights out become routine instead of exciting, when the attention she sought begins to feel hollow. And that's when the loneliness sets in. Not because she's alone, but because she's surrounded by everything that doesn't satisfy her. That's the irony of trying to outrun your feelings. No matter how fast you go, they're always one step behind you, waiting for you to get tired. And eventually she does. She gets tired of pretending that it doesn't bother her, tired of acting like it was easy to walk away. Because the more she distracts herself, the more obvious it becomes that the void she's trying to fill isn't about her circumstances. It's about what she lost. It's about connection. And deep down, she knows she had it with you in a way that these fleeting moments can't replicate. But here's where it gets even more interesting. She doesn't just miss you, she misses who she was when she was with you. Because in the absence of genuine connection, people begin to reflect on their own emotional identity. She remembers the version of herself that felt safe, seen, understood, and even if she won't admit it, she starts to realize that what she's chasing now is just an imitation of what she already had. But she traded it for what looked like freedom, and freedom without emotional grounding becomes chaos. So what does she do? She might double down on the noise. She might throw herself deeper into distractions, or she might begin to pull back and quietly reflect. That's usually when the regret surfaces, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in quiet moments of vulnerability that nobody else sees. When she's lying in bed at night, scrolling through her phone, resisting the urge to reach out. When she hears a song or smells something familiar and it jolts a memory she's been trying to bear, that's when it hits. Not because she wants to go back in time, but because she starts to understand the gravity of what was lost. That kind of realization is sobering. It forces a reckoning not just with the relationship, but with her own choices. And what's more painful than losing someone is realizing you ran from something real only to chase after what was hollow. It's a difficult truth to face. But the heart doesn't forget what mattered, no matter how much you try to distract it. Because deep down, she knows the difference between escaping and healing. And eventually, the noise won't be enough. There's a strange moment that creeps in when someone realizes they can't trigger you anymore. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly and then hits suddenly. That realization that the emotional power they once held over you is now gone can be more shocking to them than the breakup itself. Because for some people, control isn't just a byproduct of a relationship, it is the relationship. The ability to push your buttons, evoke a response, make you chase after them when they pull away. That dynamic becomes their silent proof that they still matter, that they still hold significance in your emotional world. So when that disappears, when they prod and poke, and there's nothing, no reaction, no confrontation, no emotion, it shakes them in a way few things can. It's unsettling because it's not what they expect. They expect you to be angry, to lash out, to question, to chase. But when you do none of those things, it communicates something far more powerful than words ever could, that you've moved past the place where they could reach you. And that silence is deafening. It speaks to growth, to emotional independence, to strength, and for them to a loss of identity. Because if they're no longer the person who can stir you up emotionally, then who are they to you now? The answer is often nothing. And that, more than anything, is what begins to torment them. You see, many people confuse attention with affection. As long as you're reactive, as long as you're emotionally available, even through anger or frustration, they believe they still have a place in your heart. But when your energy becomes indifferent, when your focus turns inward, and your emotional tether to them dissolves, they're left holding the pieces of a script they no longer get to play a role in. It feels like rejection, even if it's simply detachment. And for someone who thrived on the dynamic of control, that rejection is unbearable. It creates a psychological dissonance. On one hand, they might have told themselves that they're fine without you, that they made the right choice or that they've moved on. But on the other hand, your lack of reaction contradicts their narrative. If you're not angry, not bitter, not hurt, then maybe they didn't mean as much as they thought they did. That's when the regret creeps in, not because of who you were necessarily, but because of what your silence says about them. It confronts them with a mirror they were never ready to look into, a mirror that doesn't reflect the powerful, desirable figure they imagined, but rather someone who was only ever important because you made them important. This loss of influence is uniquely painful. And you need to understand it's not always about love, it's about ego, it's about identity. It's about the need to feel significant even in someone else's suffering. So when you stop suffering over them, they lose that significance. That's why some people come back not to reconnect, but to test the waters, to see if they still have that pull, to see if they can still extract a reaction from you. And if they can't, it stings in a way nothing else can. Because emotional power once lost is rarely regained. They start to reflect on their choices, not because they've had a moral revelation, but because your silence now exposes the consequences. It becomes clear that their behavior wasn't without impact, and more importantly, that they're no longer in control of the outcome. You are. You've taken back your attention, your emotions, your energy. You've reclaimed what was always yours. And that realization doesn't just break the cycle, it breaks their perception of themselves. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable for them. They begin to see the version of you that they never believed would exist without them. Strong, peaceful, focused. You're no longer explaining yourself, no longer defending your worth, no longer responding to the chaos. That's not indifference in a cold, bitter sense, it's liberation. You've outgrown the emotional ecosystem they used to thrive in, and what used to feel like power for them now feels like desperation. This is where the silence speaks louder than any argument ever could. You're no longer playing the role they assigned you. You've written your own script, and in that new narrative they have no place. They've become a footnote, and for someone who once believed they were the whole story, that's the hardest truth to accept. Because the moment you stop reacting is the moment they realize they've lost something they truly value until it was no longer accessible. There's a strange irony that plays out when someone realizes they're no longer the center of your universe. In the beginning, after a breakup, they might pretend they've moved on effortlessly. They might showcase a picture-perfect life full of laughter, confidence, and new distractions, but it's often just that, a performance. Because the truth begins to surface, not when they're being watched, but when they realize the audience is no longer there. And when they reach out, when they throw that emotional hook your way, and you don't bite, when you don't respond with desperation, longing, or even curiosity, that's when the illusion starts to fracture. That's when it dawns on them. The grip they once had on you is gone, and the grip you have on them, the grip they once had on you is gone. This realization is not just unsettling, it's destabilizing. Because for a long time, your presence in their life, whether it was through conflict or connection, validated their worth. They had a role in your story, and even when things were strained, it meant they still matter. But when you've moved to a place of genuine emotional distance, when you don't immediately respond to their message or return their call with the urgency they expect, they're forced to confront a reality they never prepared for. The silence tells a different story, a story of detachment, of healing, of boundaries. And for someone who once depended on your emotional availability to feel important, that silence becomes unbearable. So often people underestimate the power of emotional closure. They think they can return whenever they want, disrupt your peace, and find you right where they left you. Waiting. But when they come back, and you're not waiting anymore, when they find a version of you that's no longer searching for answers, they don't know what to do with that. You see, your indifference is more painful to them than any angry outburst could ever be. Because anger still means engagement. It still means they're in your thoughts. But indifference, that's the final cut. That's the moment they realize they've lost something real, something they didn't fully appreciate while it was in front of them. And this isn't about playing games. It's not about pretending to be over someone or using silence as a weapon. It's about growing to a place where their absence no longer defines your identity, where your sense of self is no longer tied to their validation or acknowledgement. That growth, slow, painful, deliberate, is what truly sets you free. And when someone who once had emotional control over you reaches back and finds that control is gone, it shatters the fantasy they've been clinging to. The fantasy that they could leave and come back whenever it suited them. The fantasy that you'd always be emotionally available, no matter the cost to your own well-being. This kind of reckoning doesn't happen in loud, dramatic moments. It happens in small, quiet realizations, in the space between messages, in the lack of urgency in your voice, in the fact that you no longer explain yourself, no longer seek understanding, no longer feel the need to correct the narrative they've created. That's when it hits them. You're no longer a part of their emotional safety net. You're not the fallback. You've outgrown the role they cast you in. And the more they realize this, the more they struggle to reconcile the version of you they knew with the version they're seeing now. The confident one. The one who's not performing, not chasing, not trying to prove anything. The one who has accepted reality, learned from it, and moved on with clarity. That version of you is the one they never anticipated. It's the one that makes them question everything they assumed about the relationship and their place in it. What they often don't understand is that peace doesn't require permission. You don't owe them your pain. You don't owe them access to your healing. And you certainly don't owe them the satisfaction of seeing you unravel when they decide to reappear. Growth means recognizing that not every hand that reaches out deserves to be held again. Sometimes it just deserves to be acknowledged and let go. With kindness, maybe, but with firmness, always. So when you respond or choose not to, you're not being cold. You're being clear. You're being grounded. You're being someone who no longer defines their worth by someone else's confusion. And that clarity is what makes them regret walking away. Not because they finally see your value, but because they finally realize you don't need them to, and that's the moment everything changes. There's something deeply unsettling to someone when they realize that they've been replaced, not necessarily by another person, but by a deeper sense of self-respect, purpose, and direction that no longer includes them. That's the part they never anticipate. It's easy for people to believe they'll always occupy space in your mind, that even if you're apart, they still linger in your heart. That illusion gives them comfort. But when they reach back out and sense that emotional space has been filled, not with bitterness, not even with someone new, but with peace, they don't know how to process it. Because let's be honest, people are not just afraid of being forgotten, they're afraid of becoming irrelevant. When someone who used to orbit your life suddenly finds themselves shut out of your emotional world, it destabilizes their sense of self, especially if they thought they had more time, more leverage, more control. But control is an illusion. And when they try to reassert it by texting out of the blue, calling when you least expect it, posting something that feels like a subtle signal, they're really testing one thing. Do they still matter to you? And when they realize the answer is no, or at least not in the way they used to, it hits them in a place they didn't even know could hurt. There's a very human tendency to believe that someone will always be available just because they were in the past. We anchor ourselves in old dynamics because they make us feel powerful or safe. But emotional maturity requires something more than nostalgia or entitlement. It demands accountability. And when someone reaches back after a long absence and encounters a version of you who no longer needs their validation, who's no longer suspended in the emotional purgatory they left you in, it forces a brutal kind of self-awareness, one they've been avoiding. You see, when a person walks away, either slowly or suddenly, they expect the world they left behind to remain static, especially if they believe they had the upper hand. But people change. And sometimes the change is quiet. It's in the way you no longer check your phone for their message, the way you stop romanticizing the past, the way you stop blaming yourself. And that's not just healing, that's evolution. And when they come back expecting to find the old version of you, the one who once tolerated uncertainty and emotional breadcrumbs, they're met with a different reality, one that is secure, one that asks for nothing, one that in its stillness speaks volumes. This kind of emotional replacement doesn't have to involve someone new. Often it's more powerful when it doesn't. Because what really unsettles them is knowing that the person they left behind learned to stand without leaning on anyone else. That you didn't use someone else to get over them. You used time, reflection, responsibility. You developed depth. You rebuilt. And what you created wasn't a performance. It was real. And real growth, real strength is the one thing they cannot compete with. So when you respond to their message with calm detachment, or perhaps don't respond at all, it's not an act of revenge. It's the result of clarity. Because when someone's absence teaches you how to value your presence, when silence becomes your sanctuary instead of your suffering, you don't give that away again. You protect it. You protect you. And here's the truth. Most people don't expect to be forgotten. They don't expect the story to go on without them. But it does, and the plot thickens. The character they once knew becomes someone wiser, more discerning, less reactive. And that change, that's what stings the most. Because it proves they weren't the reason for your strength. In fact, they were the reason you had to find it. So when she comes back after weeks, after months, and tries to reinsert herself into your life, what she's really trying to reclaim is her role in your story. But you've rewritten it. And there's no space for repetition. You've already turned the page. Let that chapter stay closed. When she finally realizes, you're not waiting anymore, when the silence on your end no longer feels like a game but a conclusion, something irreversible, she begins to feel the shift in her own emotional reality. What was once certainty begins to decay into doubt. She doesn't know how or when it happened exactly, but the control she thought she had begins to slip through her fingers. And here's the truth that most people refuse to acknowledge. Power in relationships is rarely about who speaks the loudest or who leaves first. It's about who can live with their decision and who can't. For a long time, she might have assumed your silence was temporary, a tactic, or a cry for attention, because that's how many people interpret quiet. They don't see it as strength, they see it as absence. But there comes a moment when that silence becomes something else entirely. It becomes clarity. It becomes peace. And when that realization sets in, it's incredibly destabilizing for the person who once felt certain you'd never fully detach. She may try to reach out again, maybe not directly, maybe in a subtle way, through a like, a vague message, or a mutual friend, but it's not really about reconnecting. It's about testing. Testing whether the hook still has you, whether your heart is still in the same place she left it. But when she finds the waters still, when she senses there's no longer a storm of emotion behind your name, no anticipation, no longing, what hits her is The finality, not the drama, not the argument, just the quiet certainty that she no longer has influence over you. And that kind of loss is harder to mourn because it can't be reversed. And there's something important to understand here. When someone starts to panic after your silence, it's not always because they miss you. Often it's because they miss the version of themselves that existed in your presence. Maybe she felt adored. Maybe she felt desired, validated, even admired in a way she hasn't experienced since. And when she can't access that anymore, when she realizes that your emotional well of attention has dried up, not from resentment, but from healing, that's when the regret starts to set in. That's when the masks begin to fall. Because people can pretend. They can pretend they're happier, pretend they've moved on, pretend the breakup was a path to their personal liberation, but all that performance collapses the moment they're met with indifference from someone who once cared deeply. That's the mirror they avoid, and when they finally look into it, they see their own choices reflected back. Clearly, painfully, no noise, no excuses, just consequences. What makes your silence so powerful isn't that it hurts her, it's that it forces her to confront herself. Without your attention, without your emotional availability, there's no longer a distraction from her own decisions. And that's when she starts questioning everything. Why she let it go, why she didn't take it seriously, why she believed you'd always be there. It becomes less about you and more about the part of herself she compromised in the process. That's not about romance anymore. It's about identity. It's about seeing herself from a lens she no longer controls. The irony is, she probably thought she'd be the one to move on first. Maybe she believed she'd be the one to find someone new, to prove she was right all along. But emotional closure doesn't come from outside validation. It comes from facing the void without needing someone else to fill it. And when you do that, when you walk away and build something stronger within yourself, you leave her to face what she never expected, your evolution. And that evolution isn't loud, it doesn't boast, it doesn't seek revenge, it just exists quietly, unapologetically. You go to work on yourself, you find purpose again, you connect with people who nourish you, who see you. You stop revisiting old memories like they're gospel and start treating them like lessons. And without you saying a word, that growth speaks volumes. It tells her she was part of the past, but she's not entitled to the future. So if she comes back, if she breaks the silence, you don't need to meet her with anger or resentment. You meet her with stillness. Not because you don't feel, but because you've already felt everything there was to feel. And you came out on the other side. That's the moment she realizes she didn't just lose you, she lost access to the person you were when you loved her most. And that realization will echo much louder than anything you could ever say. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone feel your absence without trying to explain it.